if we are to trust that JD Vance, then, if this is what he's about, and if America First is what it's about, then this doesn't bode well for the future of U.S. foreign policy towards Europe in particular.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement Impact at the United States Study Center. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. Last week, NATO leaders gathered in Washington, D.C. for their annual summit, this year celebrating the 75th anniversary of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What was the main objective for NATO at this summit last week, and was it achieved? Did the focus on President Biden detract from the other strategic objectives? And what is the future for NATO and the Indo-Pacific region at this time? To discuss these questions, we are delighted to welcome back our resident NATO expert, Dr. Gorana Grgic. She's back on the podcast. She's currently in residence as a senior researcher with the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic Security Team at ETH Zurich's Center for Security Studies. She was previously a Partners Across the Globe research fellow at the NATO Defense College. And she was in DC last week for the summit, and she joins us back from Europe today. So welcome back on the podcast, Gorana.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, well, a bit jet lagged, but can't complain.
Yeah. You're jet setting and you're across everything, and my goodness, there's a lot to be across. And at the end, you've got your by the numbers stat for us, so I look forward to hearing that. But to kick things off, many things were notable at this year's NATO summit. It was the 75th anniversary. It was Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's final summit as Secretary General. What were the big themes going into the summit this year, and how did it compare to prior years?
Sure. I would say there were three big themes coming into the summit, and pretty much, I think, in sort of harmony with what we've seen being discussed ever since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 and nearly half years ago. So the first big theme was obviously Ukraine and the future of aid and assistance to the country, but also its future as a potential member of NATO and how to square that circle as to providing Ukraine a firm commitment, but at the same time keeping true to what the consensus is in the alliance, and that is that Ukraine is still not ready to join the alliance, at least not while the full-scale war is going on there. Then the second big theme was one about defense and deterrence. And again, this is the sort of realization that NATO has to go back to the so-called factory settings. This year, really, it was all about strengthening the transatlantic defense industrial base, and especially focusing on how to strengthen the European pillar of NATO. So these sort of discussions that have been going on for years now, of course, about burden sharing, but truly not just about burden sharing, about making European allies more capable and truly making sure that basically there is this sort of pledge that moving forward, the industrial capacity actually for European allies to produce them, but then to also coordinate with Americans is something that we've heard a lot about, and we can unpack that in a little bit. And then finally, I think that one thing that is becoming very clear in terms of the sort of themes throughout the past couple of years at NATO is the fact that NATO isn't just thinking about security in regional sense. Of course, it's a regional organization. This is something that has been underlined a number of times, that Secretary Stoltenberg underlined all throughout, but that security is truly interlinked globally. And because we are seeing the revisionist and revanchist powers coordinating and cooperating at a scale and level we truly haven't seen since the end of the Cold War, that this is something that NATO should take notice of. And consequently, we've heard again a lot more about what China is doing independently, but also in coordinating with Russia, but not just China and Russia. We have Iran as well as North Korea joining that sort of a band of authoritarians, or as many have referred to them now as the sort of axis of upheaval. But then as a sort of response to that, what NATO can do to actually better understand what is going on in terms of this cross-regional cooperation on part of its sort of competitors and challengers, and to learn better about the Indo-Pacific. And here, truly, the name of the game is partnerships. And one set of partners stands, I would say, a little bit higher than others, and that is grouping where Australia actually belongs to in this sort of context of the Indo-Pacific Four. So these three themes, Ukraine, the kind of strengthening of defense and deterrence, particularly through focus on the defense industrial base, and then third, China and the kind of mirror of partnerships would be the third theme.
Yeah, I mean, and those are huge, and it seems like there's a massive sense of urgency around each one of those. What were the objectives for the summit? What were they hoping to get out of it by coming together, I guess, setting this agenda for going forward? And then do you think the objectives they had for this gathering were achieved?
I would say there, depending on, of course, your vantage point and who you talk to, there are maybe some points where, of course, there is still a lot that some would like to see in terms of progress. And particularly, I've already mentioned in terms of the kind of promises that have been made to Ukraine. But then at the same time, coming into the summit, I don't think that there was necessarily any sort of signal that we would see a sort of major change or kind of major change of stance, at least when it comes to Ukraine's membership in NATO. So there are things there that might be sort of left there for future summits and kind of left to be desired in terms of progress. But I think in terms of the big objectives, one thing that was on the agenda leading into the summit for months now was basically something you referenced already in your introduction, and that's the idea that while the summit was going on, everyone had kind of their side view on what's going on in terms of U.S. politics on that sort of plan of U.S. presidential election. And I think a major objective for Secretary Stoltenberg as he departs from that role has been to essentially Trump-proof Ukraine aid. And in that sense, there has been a clear deliverable, and this signals to us that at least NATO allies these days have a consensus that they think about the kind of war strategy in Ukraine removed from just the short-term aims to more medium and long-term objectives that might extend beyond the battlefield. So we had this 40 billion euro pledge that will be reviewed again next year around the support for Ukraine, but various other announcements that we've heard around, again, Ukraine's aid. So basically various security agreements that NATO members and partners have signed with Ukraine. The picture has also been very positive when it comes to the actual weapons supplies. So NATO allies have committed to providing various sophisticated defense systems. We heard the kind of breaking news that F-16 fighter jets will be flying over Ukrainian skies already this northern summer. But again, as I said, one of the, if you talk to Ukrainians and Ukrainian government representatives, which I was present at some of these discussions as part of the public forum. The fact that the communique from Washington says that Ukrainian membership is on an irreversible path, right? That Ukraine is on this sort of bridge that will get it to NATO, but it's not there yet, right? This is something that for Ukrainian officials is not exactly the news that they wanted necessarily. So there was a lot of hope, I think, when we talked last year, just during the Vilnius summit, that maybe this 75th anniversary would provide this sort of opportunity for a big splash news, but that didn't happen. And I think ultimately, in terms of, you asked about the kind of big objectives and whether they were achieved. I think the big objective was to show at the 75th anniversary of the North Atlantic Alliance that there is unity among the 32 allies. And despite all the sort of drama that, we obviously hear about around the kind of enlargement talks, and this time around NATO yet again compared to last year grew by one member. So Sweden now joined as the 32nd member after all of the hurdles were cleared. And this is again the story of NATO needing to come to consensus and show unity after we know Turkey was blocking essentially this last sort of stretch to that finish line for Sweden, and to show resolve again against Russia, especially after that horrendous attack last week on the hospital, children's hospital in Ukraine. I think from that sort of optic stance, it did portray that message. And that's also something from the signaling perspective that shouldn't be undermined. And I might stop here because I don't want to steal thunder from maybe few further conversation, or maybe open us up to kind of, the images that were coming out of Kremlin at the same time when Narendra Modi was visiting the Russian president right at the same time as NATO summit was opening. But again, from the perspective of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, I think that that sort of signal was sent, one of unity, at least for those couple of days in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so much to unpack. And one thing I remember from the conversation last year was we talked about, obviously, Ukraine desperately wants to join NATO, and they've made that appeal very, very, very clear. But we talked about if NATO were to allow them in because of their, mutual defense pledge, while there's fighting going on in the country, if they allow in a country while war is going on, that commits all of NATO to that defense. And so that was a big hurdle. So it's, as long as the war is still going on, how do you square that circle? It's very, very hard. One thing, the US was the host country this year, so it hosted it in Washington, D.C., and President Biden took the opportunity to award Secretary General Stoltenberg with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So I want to think a bit about the optics around the U.S. and President Biden this week, but first I want to think a bit about, Secretary General Stoltenberg's final summit in that role. President Biden called him, quote, a man of integrity and intellectual rigor, a calm temperament in a moment of crisis, a consummate diplomat who works with leaders across the political spectrum and always finds a way to keep us moving forward, end quote. Adding that he led NATO through, quote, one of the most consequential periods in its history, end quote. So Stoltenberg took the helm of NATO in the year that Russia annexed Crimea, and he finishes his tenure as the second Russian invasion of Ukraine is still being fought. So that's a very striking bookend to a very challenging decade. What do you think are the hallmark moments of his era in that leadership role? How successful was he in, advancing his strategic vision for NATO while he served in that role?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I, again, am reminded of last week when SecGen Stoltenberg gave his sort of parting speech to the public forum, and he was greeted with standing ovations. So that just tells you in terms of at least the pulse of that room. And of course, not a very representative sample, given that, everyone at the public forum is sort of a NATO nerd and all that. But at the same time, not every single speaker there gets a standing O. So that tells you something, at least in terms of how he's perceived in the kind of broader community of transatlantic scholars, analysts, policymakers, and so on. And of course, you mentioned the fact that his tenure extended basically to a decade nearly, right? That he's wrapping up his time as the longest serving NATO Secretary General also is a testament of what the Allies thought of him and his institutional leadership. At this point, I think that I would like to use my sort of academic, professor of international relations type of head and maybe point to something here, how actually we should be looking at how remarkable actually this tenure has been, because when we talk about military alliances, mostly scholars who take that kind of realist view, right, of the world, would say that NATO is primarily driven by state power and interests, and that, it doesn't necessarily conform to this sort of idea of an international organization where institutional leadership matters. However, I would say that for NATO, at least, when you scrutinize it carefully, NATO has all the hallmarks of a robust security organization, of an intergovernmental organization where this institutional leadership matters. So who those people who are in senior official capacities, right, who are in the secretariat really can determine in terms of agenda setting, in terms of bargaining, in terms of sort of coalition building, how the alliance navigates the sort of testing waters that it finds itself in. And I think that what we've seen over the course of SecGen Stoltenberg's tenure is that he actually was quite successful in setting agenda, but also B, in building coalitions. And we don't have to necessarily look at just the way that he's been sort of spearheading the way that the alliance responded to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian Federation, but maybe just remind ourselves of what was going on when former President Trump actually became the 45th president of the United States, and what he was doing back then in order to try to kind of keep the alliance relevant and steady. So if you take a look at some of the studies now of the sort of background of how Stoltenberg interacted with Trump, how he employed a range of strategies in order to, on the one hand, accommodate former President Trump's demands for greater burden sharing and to maintain that goodwill of the United States during the Trump's tenure and presidency, but at the same time to push back against sometimes former President Trump's sort of instincts to push for closer relations of Russia is nothing close than quite remarkable. So I think that once Mark Rutte assumes the helm later this year in October as the 14th Secretary General of NATO, I think that he also will have that sort of a big role to fill in terms of setting the agenda in the alliance and again to try to find consensus, to find these coalitions, and to keep the alliance moving forward. So in that sense, I think that many would agree, again, in the broader transatlantic scholarship community, that Jens Stoltenberg goes down in history as quite a successful NATO Secretary General. And finally, what people were worried back in February of 2022, will the conflict spill over into NATO territory? That really didn't happen. And again, this is a testament of the credibility of alliance and the commitment to what you already mentioned, Article 5, collective defense.
And moving from one leader to another, the perception in terms of the media coverage was so much of everything that you heard about NATO and the conference that week was about President Biden and his every move being scrutinized after his disastrous debate performance. And he even, I think, hyped it up because in his George Stephanopoulos interview before the NATO conference, he's like, watch me. And he's asking people to test his every move. And so every day, if he had his opening remarks at the beginning, we knew he had a lot of meetings, and he had his big press conference at the end. So much of the media narrative around the week was focused on President Biden and his performance. Did that was that similar to the vibe on the ground, like in DC? Was that how others perceived it as well? Was there a focus on Biden? I'm wondering, was that consistent? Was the media portrayal consistent with what it was like in the room? And also, did it allay concerns, or did it fuel them further? And does that distract from this overall agenda, everything that Secretary General Stoltenberg was hoping to achieve through this summit? So it's kind of a 3-part question for you there.
No, that's a great question, because for those 2 days, full 2 days, we were sort of cooned in minus levels of the Marriott Marquis complex, and we were in this conference center buried under the ground in sort of basement levels, but we obviously had access to internet. And I think that there was truly, Mari, not an hour that went by that we didn't get some sort of breaking news notification. And of course, everyone is sort of subscribed to all these different New York Times, Reuters, pick your, favorite wire or broadcaster or newspaper to send you notifications. And it was truly something that absolutely dominated all of the chatter during all of the coffee breaks, all of the meal breaks, where basically every time that there was yet another congressional statement or an op-ed penned by George Clooney, this immediately came to everyone's mobile phones, and it was something that people would discuss between the various panels. So I have to say that most of these discussions that I've had with the Americans in the room were in the end some sort of, kind of a scavenger hunt, you could say, of like little pieces of intel. Who was in the White House last? What's the vibe? Do you have insights from what's going on in the Biden campaign? Is it truly, is it true that people are, upbeat or demoralized, or how are they thinking about these things? Then kind of parsing through what did Nancy Pelosi truly mean when she said that, she supports the president, but he really needs to kind of make the decision, even though he said already that he made that decision, and so on. And, is George Clooney truly the kingmaker of future Democratic presidential candidate, and so on. So, absolutely, this was something that was on top of everyone's minds, and you just couldn't escape it. And I think that similar, at least, if you follow the coverage, at least what was going on at the NAC, the North Atlantic Council sort of sessions that were going on just a couple of sort of meters above us. It was pretty much the same.
Good to know that everyone was on the same page and the buzz. Was there an emerging consensus around, for the people who were there at the summit and they got to see him, give his opening remarks, or maybe they would have seen him in some of the different closed door meetings? Was there an emerging consensus around how he performed? Did it allay their concerns?
I think that the consensus was that he was good enough, and then an asterisk. If we put aside the fact that in introducing President Zelensky of Ukraine, he referred to him as President Putin, and then, of course, quickly, corrected himself, and then, of course, that he referred to Vice President Harris as Vice President Trump during the press conference. That's something that, of course, people pick on, right? And you said it yourself in the Stephanopoulos interview. He said, "Watch me," and people did take it literally, right? And very seriously. I think that I read a stat that over 23 million Americans watched that press conference last Thursday, and that's actually more than people who watched this year's Oscars. So I think it was, in terms of, and throw in the fact that it's summer in the US, right? You wouldn't expect that many people really tuning in and kind of being so switched on as to what's going on. But that's the problem these days, right? If you follow all of the kind of coverage around the intrigues going on in terms of the intra-party politics over on the Democrat side, that Joe Biden just did good enough, right? He was, during that press conference, in the weeds, sort of explaining what was going on at the summit, at mostly kind of a level of accuracy and engagement that we would expect from a U.S. president that is in command of what's going on. But again, some of these verbal slip-ups are things that people hang on more, and they are, of course, these kind of sound bites and video bites that get replayed more than the fact that for a good hour he was very engaged and responding to questions in a way that, again, were, to people who follow Euro-Atlantic security issues, overall made sense.
Oh, and it's interesting because at a week ago, we were thinking, how is Biden going to shift the narrative away from his age? How is that not going to be the thing everyone's talking about? And little did we know the turn that would be coming this next weekend. So I'm wondering, so we've had an assassination attempt on former President Trump, the Republican nominee for president. And then he has now just announced that Senator J.D. Vance is his running mate for vice president. And so that, kind of gazumps the news about Biden's age and those concerns. That story will come back at some stage, but right now, everything, and it's the Republican National Convention, so everything is about, Trump and Republicans and all of that. I want to know two things. I want to know, how much does this overwhelming attention on Trump and the Republican Party detract from the attention on NATO last week? And then specifically with regards to J.D. Vance, if there's a second Trump administration and J.D. Vance is vice president, what would that mean for NATO? And I'm specifically thinking of the fact that one of the main foreign policy things he's known for is leading the charge to defund support for Ukraine. And that goes back to one of the huge focuses for the summit that you mentioned earlier. But first, I guess, just Trump and the Republicans, how much does that detract with the huge media attention this week? And then JD Vance specifically, anything that we should know if he were to take the vice presidency?
Yeah, I mean, the past week truly produced way more news than we can possibly consume. And I feel that even us discussing NATO summit, right, is sort of 3 news cycles ago, right? I was just departing DC as the news broke that there was an assassination attempt on former President Trump. And then, the whole kind of story unraveled as I was basically trying to kind of again come back into European time zones and sort of then follow that with a little bit of a lag, both geographically and temporally. But of course, no one. I mean, then NATO summit doesn't matter anymore, right? Like the fact that everything that was discussed last week, and even, not that there were, again, some groundbreaking sort of news out of the summit, but at least, in terms of, you mentioned already, we discussed now, the focus on President Biden is simply not there anymore, right? And no one is anymore talking about the fact that he performed well or well enough, or however you want to assess it at that press conference. That doesn't matter. Now, whether this is a good or bad thing, of course, for President Biden, now all eyes are truly on President Trump, but maybe not in a way that Democratic campaign would have wanted it, right? Because at least now, when we are going to see, at least in the kind of immediate response to kind of polls and so on, how much this matters in terms of consolidating support on either side, right? And the conversations that are being had in the United States, as to whether this produces any kind of rally around the leader kind of effect on the Republican side, whether this turns out some of the more kind of Republican-leaning voters that might have been still on the fence and so on, even though we know the whole story, right, that people have been pretty much sort of calcified, I guess, in their camps, and there's quite a significant chunk of neither Biden nor Trump, right? But again, those are all the questions that remain to be answered. So that was the news of the weekend. And then, of course, the news of Monday is the big news coming out of Milwaukee. And on the whole nomination of J.D. Vance, junior senator from Ohio, as President Trump's running mate, as a potential vice president, should they win in November, I have to say that there are maybe 2 levels through which we need to kind of think about this pick and its potential implications on foreign policy moving forward, especially when it comes to transatlantic security and transatlantic affairs. And they are the following. One, that J.D. Vance, since he ran for the Senate and since he was elected, basically has been one of the main sort of advocates and spokespeople for America First approach, which basically sees very little, if no, role for the United States in aiding Ukraine, in sort of supporting the war effort. He said it very clearly. This is actually something that allegedly, if you take a look at some of the coverage around the sort of last couple of months when J.D. Vance made it into this sort of pool of shortlisted candidates for the job, this is something that very much appealed to Trump's family and to Trump himself, that this is basically our guy, right? That he's not this kind of establishmentarian, kind of old school Republican on foreign policy, but that he truly believes the whole America first and a more unilateralist, but in this sense also more isolationist when it comes to at least European affairs type of approach. That doesn't necessarily apply to the rest of the world, but again, if you're only looking at Euro-Atlantic security, for sure, this would be something to worry a lot of people who just met up last week in DC. But then on the other hand, we know J.D. Vance as the author of Hillbilly Elegy, of someone who was supposedly this kind of interpreter of the Rust Belt America, of the so-called forgotten people, right? As someone who was never Trumper back in 2016. He actually made a kind of a claim to fame based on that, based on kind of trying to explain why is it that people who live in maybe more like rural America, or again, deindustrialized parts of kind of Midwest and so on, why they felt this sort of sense of alienation from what was going on the coasts, right? He explained his experience going to Yale Law School, right? How he had this innate sense of he didn't belong necessarily there, that again, some of these issues of even structural inequality playing into kind of his explanation of the divide between the kind of, again, coastal elites and people who live in the kind of middle of America and so on. So it's, these days, of course, he is doubling down. He doubled down on kind of support for Trump after the assassination attempt. He actually is one of these more outspoken kind of representatives of GOP who say, no, we need to now kind of fight even harder, right, rather than calling for calm. So if we are to trust that J.D. Vance, then, if this is what he's about, and if America First is what it's about, then this doesn't bode well for the future of U.S. foreign policy towards Europe in particular. But if we look at the kind of totality of his time in the kind of national spotlight, I would say that maybe there are potentially nuances there. And now the question will be which of these J.D. Vances comes into the White House. And again, the fact that, of course, we always talk about that foreign policy is a kind of invitation for a struggle between the executive and the legislature. And so also going to be a question of who ends up getting into that Congress as well. And if it's majority sort of Republicans who are of the America First ilk, then again, this is something that is more of a concern than what we've seen during the Trump presidency between 17 and 21, and that is that President Trump was regularly challenged by the U.S. Congress on his policy towards A, Russia, but also B, towards NATO and so on. So we remember that actually the Congress during that time regularly voted for bills that were supportive of NATO, of European deterrence initiative, that passed sanctions against Russia and so on. So it's a bit more complex story, but on the surface level, the reasons to be more worried are definitely there. I wouldn't say that this is your kind of traditional kind of run-of-the-mill type of U.S. foreign policy Republican.
And it kind of pivots or goes into the last question I wanted to touch on before we get you by the numbers stat is one of the reasons that J.D. Vance gave for not wanting to fund Ukraine is because he'll say he wants to prioritize Asia. So kind of like you've mentioned, relations with Europe is in a different category in his mind than relations in other parts of the world. But one way in which that is aligned with NATO is that NATO has been having this increasingly global focus, but really working to strengthen ties with the Indo-Pacific region. So you mentioned the IP4 earlier, the Indo-Pacific 4 countries of Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. You yourself were a Partners Across the Globe fellow. And the leaders of the IP4 countries have been invited to the NATO summit for the last several years. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese did not attend the summit this year, but can you talk us through the rationale behind why NATO has been strengthening its engagement with the IP4 in particular? And what do the IP4 nations miss if their leaders don't engage or are not at these sorts of summits?
Sure. And I might actually make my way backwards. So answering the last question first, and then maybe with a quick sort of remark as to what's been going on the NATO IP4 sort of track for the past couple of years. I have to say, as a still very keen observer of Australian politics, still reading all the newspapers, watching all of these kind of news that break out of Australia, I was actually particularly struck by the limited international attention that was given to the fact that Australian PM Albanese didn't attend the summit, and that he decided to send his deputy and Minister of Defense Richard Marles to attend in his place. So I think this was a major news in Australia, and I think that there is some, I think, justified criticism that PM didn't attend because these are these are kind of the epicenters for NATO, at least for these important discussions, and especially given that the other three leaders of the IP4, so the prime ministers of Japan and New Zealand and the president of South Korea, who actually again delivered a speech at the public forum, were there, and that this gathering was important also from what I said earlier, from this signaling perspective. It was meant to demonstrate that the world's leading democracies stand united and that they are committed to preserving the rules-based order, especially given that, again, we have these competing kind of split screen images that come out of meetings when Putin and Xi have their sort of joint summits, or Putin and Kim Jong-un and so on. So from that perspective, from signaling perspective, it is a little bit of a miss. But I would agree. I think it was one of our non-resident fellows, I believe, Jane Hardy, who had an op-ed on this very issue that said Australia is not necessarily going to face any sort of negative consequences necessarily from the standpoint of the alliance. But again, it just shows you of the kind of nascent and growing importance of IP4 when some of the leaders don't show up, what this might mean in terms of the questions that are raised even within their own polity, right? And the questions that poses, and especially the fact that at the same time the leader of the opposition was in Washington for the Australia-America Leadership Dialogue, which is, again, a kind of an interesting dynamic then to have the leader of the opposition there coincidentally, but not the PM. Of course, Peter Dutton didn't attend the NATO summit by any means, but again, he was there. Now, on your other question, why is this important? The kind of sense of cooperation. So beyond these symbolic family photos that we now have seen have taken place for the past three summits, so Madrid in 22, Vilnius last year, Washington this year. This is a clear signal these days that NATO and the IP4 are ramping up their engagement, their cooperation. They think of each other these days much more in terms of how they can help secure each other's region in a sense, rather than just being engaged in what before was usually reserved for providing security to sort of third countries, right? If we think about the bulk of the engagements that NATO had with Australia, but also with Japan, with New Zealand, with South Korea, was around missions in Afghanistan, around capability and capacity building in Iraq and so on, right? This is no longer the case. These days, when the two talk, right, the two sides, they talk about the fact that Euro-Atlantic security issues affect the Indo-Pacific and vice versa, right? So what is it that they can do? Because, again, China is growing more ambitious, more assertive. On top of that, China is cooperating much more these days with Russia as a consequence of their no limits strategic partnership. And so how is it that all of these things affect all of these countries? So we know that the IP4 countries are providing a lot of aid to Ukraine, actually, that they are basically the largest non-NATO contributors to the war effort in Ukraine. We also know that there have been a lot of analogies made between Ukraine and Taiwan. So how is it that, some of these signals around deterrence can be sent? What are the lessons that we have learned in the lead up to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that could be applied in case China would like to upset that status quo across the Taiwan Strait and various other things. So, learning about societal resilience, about combating disinformation, cooperating on new and emerging and disruptive technologies, their impact. There was a lot that has been made now in terms of NATO cooperating with this minilateral as a grouping and not just on a bilateral basis with each of the four countries. So there were actually a couple of different projects that are joint that have been just announced at the summit around assistance to Ukraine, AI, disinformation, cybersecurity. And I think one thing that, could be very interesting to note here is that the IP4 were discussed at the NAC, so the North Atlantic Council session, together with the EU. So at the moment, they are elevated as partners to NATO at this kind of same sort of status that the EU has, which obviously has mostly overlapping membership with NATO, give or take a couple of countries. So that tells you a lot. But one thing and one final thing here to underscore is the fact that it has been made very clear that NATO is not interested in being present in the Indo-Pacific. It's not expanding its geographical reach in that sense. So it remains a regional alliance, but with a keen interest in global security, and that it increasingly sees the value in partnering with states that are capable and that are interested from the Indo-Pacific, just because of the sort of sense of commonality of threats and challenges all of the world's democracies and like-minded countries face at the moment.
Wow. Well, that is, a very interesting look at the future to think about going forward. And you've, taken us on a journey. We've covered everything. We've covered so many things that have all kind of been wrapped up with the NATO summit this time around. So I would love to get your by the numbers stat just before we close it off. What do you have for us?
Well, I would like to put forward a stat that I found very intriguing during these discussions at the NATO Public Forum. And this particular one had to do with the balance of government versus private sector funding for defense and security R&D, so research and development, how it was funded back some half a century ago versus today. And this was put forward by the NATO Deputy Secretary General, Mircea Joana, who said that in the 60s and 70s, 90% of all technology and innovation for defense and security was government funded. So think about NASA, DARPA, etc. Today, it's exactly the reverse. Today, 90% is private funded. And I think that this, to me, was something that, we know kind of, I guess, intuitively, that, of course, the pendulum has swung more from the government, away from the government, right, more towards the private sector. But at the level of the alliance, that this is actually the sort of balance of government and private sector funding, where these days, because of the discussions around the need to strengthen the transatlantic defense industrial base, right? The idea of the arsenal of democracy, as Kathleen Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, was talking about in her speech at this NATO Defense Industry Forum. This was something that really stuck with me, I have to say, because if we are serious at the level of the alliance about strengthening that arsenal of democracy, if we are serious about the transatlantic defense industrial base, then it's not just the governments that need to be brought into the conversation. Truly, this conversation is one where actually governments need to reimagine the way that they partner with the private sector, because it's the private sector that currently leads the charge in terms of the investments. And actually, this was something that was recognized throughout the whole 2-3 days of the summit, and basically how to essentially partner with the private sector, how to send credible signals in terms of, demand of what is needed moving forward, but also to deal with some of these issues around supply chains that have been very fragile and that have been tested, especially we've seen that coming out of the pandemic, as well as the fact that admittedly, no one can produce at the scale at the moment that, for instance, Ukraine needs. And again, coming back to the question of partnerships, for instance, this is something that I'm very interested in, just the level of the kind of traffic these days between the two theaters, between the two regions, right, where Europeans can't produce enough of ammunition, right, or can't have enough of the arms to actually divert to Ukraine, and are finding it at different places around the globe, but very much, trying to partner with reliable partners from the Indo-Pacific. So Poland had some of its biggest defense deals with South Korea. Australia made its greatest defense export to Germany, actually. So these are very interesting things that are happening. And again, this stat just struck me as to how times have changed, how, we've gone from that Cold War government basically determines everything to now where we have the private sector leading that charge. But these days, with more discussion about industrial policy, right, with more discussion about what we all need to do to basically reimagine the way that economy works as well in order to provide security for our countries. I mean, we've seen what Russia has done, essentially transformed its whole economy into a war economy, and no one is suggesting that, right? No one is saying that necessarily all of NATO needs to exactly like out Russia, but certainly to think about how this balance of funding is shaping up in terms of what the aims for the future of kind of security and defense in the Euro-Atlantic goes.
Wow, that is a stunning reversal from 90% of defense innovation being government funded to now, only 10%, and 90% of that is from private sector funding. And it reminds me of a project we've done at the center looking at Australia's private sector funding for defense innovation. So for anyone who's interested more on that topic, I'd recommend looking up the Upscale report on the USSC website, ussc.edu.au. But that is fascinating. Now, just as we wrap up, I want to point out a couple of other podcasts that might be of interest to our listeners, our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast with Jude Blanchette, the Freeman Chair for China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, which includes Guarana had previously written or had hosted a NATO series with different experts from NATO doing these talks with us. There were virtual talks, but the recordings are available on the USSC Live podcast channel. So I'd recommend people go and check that out. You can find these at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Guarana, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Mari, as always. And of course, I can't wait for the future podcasts to drop, and certainly the coverage that the USSC does of everything that's going to be happening over the next 4 months. I think it's